What happens when two young girls walk down a familiar street, in the middle of the afternoon, and are never seen again? That was the question gripping Maryland in March 1975. Sheila Lyon, age 12, and her younger sister Katherine, age 10, left their quiet suburban home in Wheaton to walk to the local shopping mall. They were supposed to return by 4 p.m. for dinner. They never came back. In the decades that followed, the case of the missing Lyon sisters would evolve into one of the most haunting and perplexing child disappearances in American history. Every detail, every rumor, every whispered sighting became part of a dark puzzle. Yet even with massive media coverage, intense police work, and the full attention of a terrified community, no one could explain what happened on that ordinary spring afternoon. This wasn't just another missing persons case. It became the defining story of fear in Montgomery County. Parents who once let their kids walk to the mall without a second thought now clutched their hands tighter. Strangers were no longer friendly neighbors, but potential threats. The Lyon sisters' disappearance didn't just shatter a family, it ripped through an entire generation's sense of safety. But how did two children vanish in broad daylight from one of the busiest places in town? And how did the search for answers spiral into one of the largest investigations Maryland had ever seen? The story begins with a scene that seemed almost too ordinary to carry such horror. March 25, 1975. The weather was mild, the streets of Wheaton were alive with children enjoying spring break. The Lyon sisters left their Kensington home around 11 a.m. to go to Wheaton Plaza, the bustling shopping mall about a half-mile away. They promised their mother, Mary, they'd be home by 4. Witnesses would later describe the girls as cheerful, browsing toy stores, flipping through records at the music shop, and stopping to grab lunch at the Orange Bowl, a popular restaurant inside the mall. Their day looked like any other carefree afternoon. But woven into that ordinary scene was something unsettling. Several witnesses recalled seeing the girls speaking to an unidentified man outside the mall. He carried a tape recorder and seemed to be asking them questions. Some said he had long hair and appeared in his late teens or early 20s. He became known in the press as the tape recorder man. Who was he? A harmless stranger? A friend? Or the last person to see the Lyon sisters alive? As the hours ticked by, the girls failed to return home. Their mother grew worried. By 7 p.m., the panic set in. Richard Lyon, their father, a well-known local radio announcer, contacted police. The response was immediate. This wasn't a case where children might have run away. Sheila and Katherine were described as responsible, cautious, and deeply attached to their family. Running off made no sense. Something had gone wrong. That night, police began canvassing the area. They retraced the sisters' steps, interviewing store clerks and patrons at Wheaton Plaza. Flyers with the girls' photographs were printed overnight and distributed across Montgomery County. Their faces soon appeared on every telephone pole, in every shop window, on every street corner. The search was massive. More than 100 officers, aided by volunteers, scoured wooded areas, drainage ditches, and nearby neighborhoods. Bloodhounds were brought in, but no scent trail could be followed beyond the mall. It was as if the girls had simply evaporated. And yet, while the police searched the physical landscape, another story was beginning to unfold in the psychological one, the rumors, the whispers, the fear. Parents were terrified. Local newspapers published front-page stories daily. Television crews camped outside the Lyon family's home. The public wanted answers, but none came. If hundreds of eyes had seen the girls that day, how could no one see where they went? The timeline was precise. The girls left home in late morning. They were confirmed inside the mall by numerous witnesses between 1 and 2 p.m. By around 2:30, they were last positively seen outside near the Orange Bowl, talking to the man with the tape recorder. After that, nothing. The disappearance sparked an avalanche of tips. Police received thousands of calls. Some claimed the girls had been seen in nearby towns. Others insisted they were spotted hitchhiking along a highway. Still others swore they had been abducted by a mysterious man driving a beat-up station wagon. Each lead was checked. None held up. As days stretched into weeks, the story only grew darker. The absence of evidence became evidence in itself. No ransom note arrived. No suspicious phone calls were traced. There was no sign of foul play in the family's home. It was a disappearance without a trace. But then, one detail began to dominate the investigation, a witness account that described a man lingering around Wheaton Plaza, watching children. He drove what was described as an old Ford station wagon, with rusted panels and a faded paint job. Witnesses recalled him staring at the Lyon Sisters more than once. This became the infamous sketch suspect, a man with shaggy hair and a predatory stare. Was this the same man as the tape recorder stranger, or a different figure entirely? The media latched onto this lead, plastering a composite sketch across newspapers. Residents thought they recognized him. Calls poured in. But still, no arrest. No girls. And so the case moved from urgent rescue into something more chilling, the possibility that Sheila and Katherine had been abducted, concealed, and perhaps never coming home. For the Lyon family, it was unthinkable. For investigators, it was a nightmare. The community's fear turned to anger. Why had no one protected the sisters? Why hadn't the mall security noticed something? Why hadn't anyone stopped a man who seemed suspicious? Every unanswered question deepened the wound. And yet, the most haunting question remained: were the girls still alive, waiting to be found? Or had their fates already been sealed before anyone realized they were gone? The investigation was about to grow larger, pulling in multiple jurisdictions, FBI agents, and hundreds of detectives over the years. But in those first few days, as March turned to April, the focus was simple: 2 little girls had walked to the mall. And they had vanished into thin air. And that's where the story begins to shift. Because while police searched the woods and highways, another story was emerging from the shadows, one that would expose not only suspects, but a darker undercurrent in American society at the time. What if the answer to the disappearance of Sheila and Katherine Lyon was hiding in plain sight all along? What if the man everyone had described, the shadowy figure lurking around Wheaton Plaza, was not some fleeting ghost of memory but a living predator who had slipped through the cracks? As April 1975 unfolded, the investigation intensified. The FBI was called in, an unusual move for a missing persons case at the time. Why? Because the stakes had grown too high, and local police feared that what they were dealing with was not just a neighborhood crime but something bigger. National attention descended on Wheaton, turning the Lyon sisters into household names. Their photographs stared back from television screens, newspapers, and magazines across the country. But publicity was a double-edged sword. For every credible tip came a flood of false ones. People claimed they had seen the sisters as far away as Pennsylvania, Florida, even California. For the Lyon family, each report raised hopes, only to crush them again when the leads went nowhere. And yet, in the middle of all the noise, certain details began to repeat themselves. The mysterious tape recorder man. The old station wagon. The stranger who seemed too interested in children at the mall. Could all of these be pointing to the same figure? One witness described the man asking children if they would record their voices for a project. Another said he had been offering candy. These were not random acts. They were grooming tactics, carefully calculated to lure young victims. The police released a composite sketch based on these reports: a man with long hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a lean face. The drawing burned into the public's memory. But as with so many cases, sketches can mislead. People began pointing fingers at neighbors, acquaintances, even friends, seeing similarities where none existed. What if the most famous sketch in the case wasn't even the right man? The investigation then took a darker turn. A convicted child sex offender named Ray was questioned after several witnesses placed him near Wheaton Plaza that day. He drove a car similar to the one described, and his record was enough to raise alarms. But the trail fizzled. No physical evidence tied him to the sisters. Police were left with suspicions but no proof. Meanwhile, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. The Washington Post ran constant coverage. The Montgomery Journal printed almost daily updates. Each headline screamed urgency. Where are the Lyon sisters? Thousands joined search. Mothers keep children home. For the community, it was no longer a mystery. It was a collective nightmare. Parents refused to let their children out alone. Malls that once bustled with carefree teenagers now felt haunted. If fear could be measured, then Wheaton in 1975 was drowning in it. But it wasn't just fear, it was obsession. People became amateur detectives. Neighbors whispered about strange cars. Teachers recalled odd encounters. Tips stacked into boxes at police headquarters. By summer, the case file on the Lyon sisters was thousands of pages thick, yet the answers remained painfully thin. Among the revelations was a haunting realization: the disappearance wasn't just about two little girls. It symbolized something larger, the fragility of childhood in America during the 1970s. At a time when communities prided themselves on safety, when children roamed free without fear, the Lyon case shattered that illusion. And then came the first major twist. Months into the search, witnesses began reporting not just one suspicious man, but two. A second man, older, heavier, and more imposing, had been seen loitering near the Orange Bowl restaurant at the mall. Some claimed he had been following the girls. Others said he had been speaking to the first suspect, the tape recorder man. Suddenly, investigators had to ask, was this a coordinated effort? Were there two predators working together? If one man could lure, and another could take, had the community been staring at not one, but a pair of predators hiding in plain sight? The revelation that two men might have been involved ignited fresh panic. Detectives combed through criminal records, searching for duos of known offenders. They expanded their net, looking at drifters, ex-convicts, and transient workers who passed through Wheaton in the spring of 1975. Each lead seemed promising, until it collapsed under scrutiny. And yet, within the chaos, a chilling pattern emerged. Several witnesses described seeing the girls leave the mall willingly, not by force. They were seen walking with one or possibly both men, as if they trusted them. That detail shook investigators to their core. If true, it meant the sisters had not been violently snatched, but carefully manipulated into walking toward their fate. Was it possible the Lyon sisters had been tricked into their own disappearance? For the Lyon family, the revelations were unbearable. Richard Lyon, used to speaking on radio with composure, now addressed the media with trembling hands, begging for any information that would bring his daughters home. Mary Lyon, their mother, withdrew from the public eye, consumed by grief and worry. Their three surviving sons lived under the crushing shadow of absence. Every knock at the door, every ringing phone, felt like it could be the answer, but it never was. By the end of 1975, the case had grown colder. Leads dried up. The FBI scaled back. The media moved on. But the mystery remained, gnawing at the community, haunting the detectives who couldn't let go, and lingering in the hearts of those who wondered if justice would ever come. And that's when the story started to evolve again. Because sometimes, cases don't fade quietly into history. They transform. They gather new details, new suspects, new rumors. The Lyon sisters' disappearance wasn't just a crime frozen in time. It was about to become one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern era, with shadows that stretched far beyond Wheaton Plaza. How do two girls vanish in broad daylight, on a familiar road, with no clear trace? That question haunted investigators from the start, and it's what makes the Lyon sisters' disappearance one of the most chilling cases in American history. The search for Sheila and Katherine exploded within hours. Police flooded Wheaton and surrounding towns. Helicopters scanned fields. Bloodhounds followed what little scent they could pick up. Thousands of volunteers combed through wooded areas, drainage ditches, and abandoned buildings. It wasn't a missing child search anymore. It was a massive manhunt. But here's the disturbing part: for every path investigators chased, there seemed to be another door that slammed shut. One witness said they saw the girls walking home. Another swore they spotted them in a nearby park. A third believed they entered a car near the shopping center. Each account pulled the search in a different direction, spreading confusion like wildfire. And then came the first real jolt. Several witnesses described seeing the sisters near a man with long hair, carrying a tape recorder. He was asking children to record their voices, an odd detail that stuck in everyone's mind. The man became known as Tape Recorder Man. Who was he? What was his purpose? And most importantly, what did he do with the girls? The police clung to that lead, plastering his sketch across newspapers and television. But no arrest followed. No man came forward. No girls were returned. The image lingered in the community like a shadow, a reminder that someone out there had walked away with the sisters, bold enough to stand in plain sight. The trail grew colder with each passing day. Families locked their doors. Parents stopped letting children walk outside alone. Wheaton, once a quiet suburb, was gripped by fear. The silence around the sisters' fate became deafening. But then, weeks later, a letter arrived. And it wasn't a simple message. It was taunting. The writer claimed to know what happened to Sheila and Katherine. He gave details only someone close to the crime would know. The words dripped with cruelty, as if the writer fed on the family's pain. Was this the break investigators needed, or a cruel prank designed to waste time? The community held its breath, desperate for an answer. And as detectives chased that letter, another detail surfaced, pulling the case toward a darker possibility than anyone expected. Why would someone taunt a grieving family? Was it arrogance, or a mask to hide the truth? The arrival of the letters cracked open a new chapter in the Lyon Sisters case. The first note was vague but unsettling. It hinted at the girl's fate, dangling hope while twisting the knife of uncertainty. Then came a second letter. This one was sharper, crueler. It mocked the family and police, claiming the girls were gone forever. The handwriting was erratic, the tone chilling. Some investigators believed it was authentic, written by the abductor himself. Others suspected a hoax, a disturbed mind feeding on chaos. But what made the letters impossible to ignore were the details, phrases and descriptions that matched witness accounts from them all. For weeks, detectives clung to the possibility that these notes might lead to the girls. They analyzed every stroke of ink, every phrase, hunting for fingerprints, hidden codes, anything. But the more they studied, the more the letters seemed like a cruel trap, pulling resources away from other leads. And then came a bombshell. An anonymous caller phoned the Lyon family home. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. He claimed to have the girls. He demanded silence. No police, no FBI, or the sisters would die. He gave cryptic instructions for a possible drop-off. But when detectives scrambled to follow, the caller vanished. No follow-up. No exchange. No sisters. Was this the same man behind the letters? Or was Wheaton plagued by more than one predator, one real, one opportunist, both feeding on tragedy? The false leads piled up like ashes. But then, out of nowhere, the investigation shifted again. A new witness claimed to have seen something different, something darker. A station wagon. A man. The girls inside. The image sent shockwaves through the case. If true, the sisters had been taken quickly, efficiently, hidden away before police even launched their first search. But who was the man? And why did it take weeks for this testimony to surface? Every answer seemed to open another hole in the story. Every trail split into two. And as the leads multiplied, so did the lies. What kind of man walks among neighbors by day and hides a predator's secret by night? As the years dragged on with no resolution, suspicion began circling around a name that had lingered in the background since the earliest days of the search: Lloyd Welch. Locals knew him as odd, unreliable, always drifting from job to job. At first glance, he seemed harmless, almost pitiful. But his record told a different story. He had a history of petty crime, burglary, drugs, and whispers of darker behaviors that were harder to pin down. On the day the Lyon sisters vanished, Lloyd was reportedly at the Wheaton Plaza Mall. Witnesses recalled a young man lingering near the girls, his attention fixed where it shouldn't have been. But his presence was dismissed at the time. He blended into the chaos of leads, false alarms, and mallgoers who thought they saw something. For decades, his name was there, buried in old files, overshadowed by louder suspects. Then, in the 2000s, a breakthrough reignited the trail. Investigators re-examined statements. Old witness accounts, once brushed aside, pointed back to Welch with haunting clarity. One tip stood out. A teenager had claimed to see Welch talking to Sheila and Katherine at the mall, trying to lure them with a cheap trick, an offer of free candy, the kind of bait predators use when words alone aren't enough. The teen remembered his unease, the gut feeling that something wasn't right. But that wasn't all. A family connection put Welch under even darker light. His relatives, scattered across Maryland and Virginia, spoke in fragments, half-truths, and nervous pauses. It was as though everyone knew something but no one wanted to say it out loud. And when pressed, some hinted that Welch had brought trouble home around the very time the girls disappeared. What kind of trouble? What exactly did Welch do, or know, that tied him to the sisters? The answers were buried, but the dirt was starting to shift. Police began looking harder at Welch, not as a shadow on the edge of the case, but as the man at its core. And when the full story of his life came into focus, the suspicion deepened into something chilling. The predator wasn't a stranger to the case. He had been there all along. What if the truth of a crime doesn't sit with one man, but festers inside a family, hidden behind locked doors and whispered warnings? When investigators dug deeper into Lloyd Welch's life, they uncovered a web of dysfunction and silence that stretched across generations. The Welch family wasn't ordinary. Their homes in rural Virginia carried an air of isolation, secrecy, and something darker that neighbors struggled to name. Relatives hinted at abuse that had been passed down like a sickness. The kind of abuse that corrodes trust, breeds lies, and teaches children to keep their mouths shut. To outsiders, this was a family living on the margins. To insiders, it was a place where cruelty became routine. When detectives re-interviewed family members decades later, memories cracked open. Some said they remembered Lloyd arriving home around the time of the Lyon sisters' disappearance. He wasn't alone. He seemed panicked, carrying something, and speaking in half-finished sentences. Others remembered whispers of the girls being brought to the house, though no one claimed to have seen them directly. One cousin spoke of strange bonfires that blazed in the Welch yard that week. Another recalled a heavy odor, something that didn't smell like wood or trash. And there were mutterings, half-warnings, half-confessions, that Lloyd and perhaps other men in the family had done something unforgivable. The more investigators pressed, the more the family fractured. Some members flat out denied knowing anything. Others grew nervous and evasive. A few, perhaps haunted by decades of silence, began sharing pieces that finally fit the puzzle together. It wasn't just about Lloyd anymore. It was about a family culture that enabled him, protected him, maybe even helped him cover up his crime. The Lyon sisters' disappearance, long thought to be the work of a lone predator, now looked like a tragedy rooted in collective guilt. But how do you prove something when the evidence has been burned, buried, or silenced for 40 years? The key would lie not only in testimony, but in breaking the code of silence that had kept the Welch family's darkest secret hidden. What breaks a silence that has lasted 4 decades? Sometimes it's not guilt. Sometimes it's fear. Fear of being caught. Fear of being associated forever with the crime that haunted an entire community. When police reopened the Lyon Sisters case, they knew they couldn't rely on physical evidence alone. Too much time had passed. The trails were cold. The woods had grown back. The ashes of those strange bonfires were long gone. But memory has a way of eroding defenses, especially when questions return again and again. Detectives began to revisit every branch of the Welch family tree. They knocked on doors. They sat across kitchen tables. They asked the same questions in slightly different ways, pressing into cracks that had been sealed with lies. And slowly, those cracks began to widen. Some relatives said Lloyd bragged about what he did. Not in clear words, but in insinuations. He liked to remind people that he'd been part of something bigger, something too terrible to name. Others admitted they saw him come home with stained clothes, nervous eyes, and a story that shifted with every telling. One family member confessed they'd been told to keep quiet or else. Another admitted they always suspected the worst, but no one dared confront it. The Welch family was a nest of threats and silence, where children learned early that asking questions could bring pain. Investigators pieced these fragments together. Each testimony was like a shard of broken glass, dangerous on its own, but revealing a picture when fitted side by side. The story began to take shape. Lloyd Welch had not acted alone. The girls were taken, held, and likely killed with more than one set of eyes watching. But still, the truth slipped through their hands. The family had grown skilled at half-answers. They had survived decades by burying their memories in layers of denial. The case teetered between myth and reality. Yet, one thing became undeniable: the silence was no longer unbroken. Cracks had appeared. And through those cracks, the horror of what happened to Sheila and Katherine Lyon began to seep out, forcing everyone to confront a past they had tried so hard to forget. And with each fracture, detectives inched closer to the truth. How long can a man run from the truth before it catches up with him? Lloyd Welch had been running for 40 years. He had crossed state lines, lived under shadows, and built a life from fragments of lies. But every trail eventually circles back. And his circle was closing fast. The FBI and Montgomery County detectives played a patient game. They knew Welch was slippery, but they also knew time had not been kind to him. He was aging, worn down, and locked away on unrelated charges. Prison bars had a way of stripping bravado. Outside, he could dodge questions. Inside, there was nowhere to run. So they began to lean on him. They laid out fragments of testimony. They brought up names of relatives who had already spoken. They hinted at evidence buried in files too thick to ignore. Welch shifted in his chair, trying to calculate what the police actually knew and what they were bluffing. At first, he gave them stories. Wild, shifting tales of strangers, cults, even faraway killers. He tried to weave a maze of confusion, hoping investigators would get lost inside it. But the detectives had heard it all before. Each lie he told became another rope tying him down. Each contradiction added weight to the suspicion. Meanwhile, the family web was unraveling. Cousins, uncles, and even his own father's name surfaced in whispers of involvement. Some hinted at abuse that had gone back generations. Others spoke of a basement where dark secrets lingered, or nights when screams were muffled before neighbors could hear. The pressure mounted. Every visit, every interview, every careful prod chipped away at Welch's defenses. And though he never gave a full, clean confession, his words began to betray him. He slipped, he hinted, he confirmed details only the killer would know. Piece by piece, investigators built the case. For the Lyon family, the wait was agonizing. Decades had stretched into a lifetime of unanswered questions. Now, at last, the walls were closing in on the man who had haunted their nights and birthdays and empty chairs at the dinner table. But would those walls hold? Would they finally bring justice, or would the truth remain tangled in half-remembered lies? The answer lay in what came next: a courtroom, a plea deal, and a confrontation that would test the limits of closure. What does justice look like when it arrives 4 decades too late? For the Lyon family, it was never going to be the joyful return of Sheila and Katherine. The best they could hope for was an answer, a name, a man finally forced to face what he had done. By 2014, prosecutors had built their case against Lloyd Welch brick by brick. They had his inconsistent confessions. They had relatives willing to testify about what they'd seen or suspected. They had physical searches that unearthed evidence of violence and concealment at his family's property in Bedford County, Virginia. It wasn't a perfect case, time had washed away much of the physical proof. But what remained was powerful enough to confront him. Welch was brought before a grand jury. For hours, prosecutors laid out the story: how the two sisters were lured outside a mall on March 25, 1975, by the promise of candy and attention. How Welch, then just 18, had been spotted near the scene. How his lies over the years betrayed a guilty knowledge no bystander would possess. How family members recalled carrying heavy bags, reeking of decomposition, into wooded hollows. The courtroom air was heavy, every detail reopening old wounds. The Lyon parents sat quietly, their faces worn but resolute. For decades, they had lived in limbo, unsure if they would ever hear the truth. Now, they were watching it unfold. Welch's defense team tried to muddy the waters. They suggested others in the family were responsible, that Welch was only repeating things he had heard, not things he had done. They pointed out the lack of a body, the gaps in the timeline, the inconsistencies in memory after 40 years. But in the end, Welch himself was the anchor that dragged the whole narrative down. His own words, recorded over multiple interviews, revealed knowledge he should not have had unless he had been there. The prosecution pressed him until his lies collapsed. Cornered, Welch agreed to a plea deal. He admitted involvement in the abduction of Sheila and Katherine Lyon. He acknowledged that the girls had been killed and disposed of with the help of others. In exchange, the death penalty was taken off the table. On September 12, 2017, Lloyd Welch was sentenced to 48 years in prison. He was 60 years old. For all practical purposes, he would die behind bars. When the sentence was read, the room fell silent. No celebration. No victory. Only the solemn weight of resolution. John and Mary Lyon, the parents who had endured more than 4 decades of grief, walked out quietly. They didn't speak of revenge. They spoke of finality, of gratitude to the detectives and prosecutors who refused to let the case die, and of the relief that their daughter's story would no longer end in a question mark. Still, the mystery lingers. The full truth of what happened in those final hours has never been revealed. Welch never confessed to the full details, never offered a map or a burial site. The bodies of Sheila and Katherine Lyon have never been found. Their resting place remains a secret buried with the past. But justice, though delayed, was served. The man who preyed on 2 young sisters in 1975 was finally stripped of his lies and condemned to spend the rest of his life caged. And the case of the Lyon sisters became more than a local tragedy. It became a lesson in persistence, in the power of memory, in the refusal to let a monster escape simply because time has passed. Because in the end, time is the enemy of justice. But in this case, it also became its ally. For decades, the Lyon family carried a silence no parent should ever bear. A conviction may close the courtroom, but it does not close the heart. Their daughter's laughter was stolen, their future erased. And the echoes of that loss remain, haunting every corner of Maryland's history.